with that, I wanted to introduce give you a little bit of guide of what we're going to be doing in this next hour and a half, more or less. We're going to have Dr. Catherine Brinkley, who's an associate professor of human ecology at UC Davis, talk to us about past pandemics. I saw her give a talk a couple of months back, and it was really inspiring to understand. She's looked at many years of pandemics before us and helps us understand what we might be learning, what might change and what might not change with this coming pandemic. The pandemic we're in. There's not one coming, I promise. We're in this one, and hopefully it'll be gone soon. Warren Logan, who's a policy director of mobility and interagency relations in the mayor's office in the city of Oakland, who's going to be talking about the program around slow streets, some steps and missteps and pivots that the city went through, the very kind of frank and honest discussion of what went well and what didn't, and really a model of how of nimble and responsive government. Really interesting work. And then we got Dr. Goodchild, who's a professor and director at the University of Washington. He directs the supply chain transportation logistics group, and is going to be talking about e-commerce and how we can make sure we're not really making cities that make us victims of e-commerce. Really excited for these three presentations. And I will start by introducing Catherine. Catherine, I'm going to stop sharing it and you can start sharing your screen. There you are, great. So Catherine is an associate professor in human ecology at the University of Davis, University of California, Davis. She has a PhD in city planning, also has a public health degree. So this is, I mean, you're like the ideal person to talk about pandemics and planning. I'm so glad you exist. She's been a Fulbright Scholar, a Watson Fellow, NSF Career Award winner, and we are thrilled to have you here and look forward to the presentation. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Nico. So to start, what's the one thing people complain about most during public comment period? I'd say it's parking. And all it took was one pandemic and poof, cities got rid of parking. There are sidewalk cafes, slow streets, and reclamation of roads for walking and biking. Pandemics have a way of forcing us to do what we should have done. And this pandemic is no different than those in the past. So I know we have a lot of transportation planners in the room, so I thought I'd start with a classic transportation joke. Why did the chicken cross the road? You can drop your answers in the chat. They can be horrible because it's early in the morning, and I promise you my joke side of this is also horrible. So as Nico mentioned, I'm an urban planner, but I also have a veterinary medical degree and a master's in virology. And I view land use planning through the lens of One Health, which is that health is shared between humans, animals, and the environment. And that means that land use planning has a large role in preventing pandemics, but also mitigating the ill effects of them. So why did the chicken cross the road? It's way too soon to talk about the next pandemic. Which is a very bad joke, I realize. I've explored this topic, and legalizing poultry ordinances have cropped up in most cities. So you can ask yourself, which came first, the chicken or the plague? And I think that poultry disease jumping into human populations is a big risk, and I'm not the only one who thinks that. And there are land use codes we could enact right now to prevent the next pandemic. So if you're interested in that, I've dropped a citation on this slide and you're welcome to check it out. But today, I'm going to talk to you about pandemics of the past. And I use that layup to say that sadly, this is not the last pandemic we will experience, and it is not the first. So here's on the right some major pandemics that cities have weathered, and this should first off let you know that despite all the hype that this is the end of cities, it's not. Cities rebound. Another important point is that 75% of the emerging disease we see is from animal origin, and if you look at the last couple of the last dozen or so of pandemics, you'll see that 8 out of the 10 of them are airborne. And these pandemics pose particular engineering problems as we need to keep a distance between people to break cycles of transmission. And this is where land use planning is key. So if there are just 2 things I want you to take away from my talk today, I want you to know and take some comfort from the fact that we've been here before and we were forced to do better because of it. And this moment in time is not going to be any different. The other piece that I want you to take away is that when the most vulnerable are at risk of disease, we are all vulnerable. So land use planning really needs to pay attention to people on the margins, their health, their safety, their welfare, because everyone is at risk when they are at risk. To prove my point, I am going to review 400 years of city plans in response to pandemics. And I looked at the four most populous US cities from the 1600s forward: New York, Baltimore, Boston, and Philadelphia. So this is archival research that I'm presenting. We're going to start in the 1600s. We're not going to start in the US, we're going to start in London. So 1666, there was a huge fire in London, which wiped out 80% of the old city, creating a lot of homelessness. In addition, there was a plague, which killed 15% of the population, and a war. So compounding problems, just as we're seeing now. And just as we're seeing now, cities got a bad rap as being unhealthy places. And they were prompted to make changes that they needed to make all along. So the building code of 1667 in London aimed at preventing fire and making the city safer. And that included building codes that would change buildings to brick and stone. But the horrible experiences of London also prompted the creation of other cities, namely Philadelphia, which was then a British colony. So William Penn set out designing Philadelphia as a new capital, and he said it would be a green country town which would never be burnt and always wholesome. And you can see his plan on the right here. There are broad streets and boulevards which are meant to be fire breaks and also allow fire brigades to get in. The city has rivers on both sides, creeks infiltrating it. How could a fire get in there? And also the control systems were meant to have good sewage and water runoff to prevent disease. So let's see how it turned out for Philadelphia. As you know, Philadelphia was the nation's capital. I'm sure many of you didn't know that. Philadelphia lost the status as the nation's capital in part due to a yellow fever epidemic that broke out in 1793. And this prompted city leaders to yet again try and create a new city which would be healthier, Washington, D.C. So the yellow fever epidemic killed about 10% of the city's population. And like today, people with the means fled the city. So the political elite, including President Washington. And it was up to the leaders who stayed behind to tend to the sick and dying. Reverend Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were two Black leaders who organized essential workers going door to door to collect the sick and bring them to centralized hospitals that they set up, and also going door to door to collect the dead and bury them. You can imagine they experienced quite a bit of racism and pushback as they were going door to door. They also organized people to clean gutters and clear alleyways, demonstrating the need for early zoning and public health laws, which would separate pedestrian traffic from garbage on the backside of houses. And that cleanup likely helped reduce the mosquito population, which was causing yellow fever. Not incidentally, Reverend Jones and Richard Allen fought racism and disease at the same time, just as essential workers today must. So also in 1793, President Washington was busy coordinating the Fugitive Slave Act. And this was a law which put free Black men and women at risk of being captured, taken to the South, and then proving that they were free people in the courts. It also classified children born to fugitive slave mothers as property. In addition to that, there was one of those green squares that you saw in William Penn's map of Philadelphia was a central gathering part for the Black community called Congo Square. And that was the square that was that became the mass burial site for yellow fever victims. That square was since renamed Washington Square after George Washington. The everyday codified racism that Allen and Jones faced prompted them to write this refutation pamphlet that you see on the right. And this ought to be required reading in all history books, the way that Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet is. That it's not as a testimony to our willful collective amnesia in the education system and our willful collective amnesia about diseases of the past and honestly racism. We have not done enough to honor healthcare heroes of past pandemics. Central gathering spots for communities of color have literally been turned into mass graves and renamed after leaders who undermined efforts to tend to the sick city. So an urgent, no regrets job that public art and historic preservation can do is to tell these histories and also to remember to tell the history that we're living right now. So we don't keep forgetting that we've been here before and who helped us get out of it. Who is the essential worker? The next big pandemic that swept across the US was cholera. This is a fecal oral pathogen that spread through contaminated water. And again, the response of cities was to make parks. In New York's case, Central Park. So it wasn't that there was nothing there before Central Park was there. In order to make room for the park, police were dispatched into low-income neighborhoods full of Irish immigrants, free Blacks, and First Nations people. This was a neighborhood that ran pig feeding operations where garbage was collected and processed because there was no municipal garbage service in these early cities. So you layer on top police brutality, civil unrest, economic recession, terrible air quality, lack of affordable housing, and we've still been there before. This picture shows Superintendent Downing evicting the poor and is captioned "Intense Discontent." By removing waste processing and the food supply, as well as livelihoods, New York City necessitated the creation of public food and housing programs, along with sanitation departments. This was very expensive for cities. In addition, New York Central Park would house a reservoir which was designed to deliver fresh, clean water. And this would be the nation's first great aqueduct system. So cities today should be prepared to take on more costs, especially if state and federal governments don't help. Anti-eviction legislation that's being passed in states across the US is a great example of this, in addition to guaranteed income and universal basic income programs like that piloted in Stockton, California. So as I mentioned before, 8 of the last 10 pandemics have been airborne, and these are really tricky to out-engineer. We've also been stuck on some false understandings of how density impacts disease. This is a tweet from Governor Cuomo. He says, New York must develop an immediate plan to reduce density, as if New York could do that, and as if that would be New York City once it happened. Major cities are entry points for disease. There are a lot of people, a lot of hosts, so disease quickly amplifies. But history shows us that suburbs and rural areas fare worse during pandemics and after. So here's a graph that shows how COVID deaths in small cities and medium-sized cities eventually overcame total number of deaths, percentage of deaths in large cities. And the reason for this is that in rural areas have fewer, smaller, and less well-equipped hospitals. In addition, when pandemics cause joblessness, unemployment, and economic recession, rural areas take longer to rebound. In a country without universal health care, there's a strong tie between health and those who can afford health care. So if history is any lesson, cities will rebound from COVID much more quickly, and disease will linger, as well as its ill effects in suburbs and rural areas. So just to summarize these 400 years, some things have stayed the same. There's been a disproportionate impact on low-income immigrants and communities of color. The CDC shows a 5 times higher hospitalization rate for non-whites. There have also been some go-to public health and land use planning innovations, namely adding more green space. With this pandemic, the rationale is mental health and physical activity, as we'll hear about later. In addition, it's up to cities. It's up to cities to invest and to make some really big changes very quickly with zoning and building codes, as well as taking on giant new expenses in food, housing, water, and waste. There are some differences. So this inflection point, cities gave up parking. We changed the way we eat. We're eating outdoors now. And a lot of cities are saying that they like it and they're trying to keep it. We opened streets to protests as well as commerce to keep brick and mortar businesses alive. We have anti-eviction legislation, which is that's really huge, as well as guaranteed and universal basic income pilots. We live in an online world. We're not skipping a beat. We're here at a conference together. We're going to hear about e-commerce as well. And we also have a lot of data. So it's easy for us to learn from each other. So this next piece that I'm going to end on is an effort for us to help cities learn from pilots that they are doing. So right now, you can search, and I think Becky will put the link in the chat, for any term in a city or county general plan in California. We've created this database of over 500 plans, nearly all city and county plans. If there's anything you're interested in, whether it's e-scooters or LGBTQ, historic preservation sites, or environmental justice, and your city is updating its plan, or you just want to know what's out there, or frankly, what isn't out there, you can enter a search term into this portal that we've built, and it will pull up search hits across city and county general plans. And then you can click on the year that each plan was crafted, and you can pull up the plan itself and look for it in the context of all of the images and graphs that are included in the plan. So the goal with this project is really to help speed up cities learning from one another and learning from the best practices that are out there. Right now, California has mandated, California cities and counties need to include environmental justice to undo wrongs and to make sure that development doesn't have undue impact on marginalized communities. So as cities are updating their plans, they can take a look and see what other places have done to address environmental justice. So with that, I am ending and opening for questions. And this is, these are images from a study abroad class I teach, where we go to Europe and look at sustainable solutions. And I put this in here to remind us that American cities probably need to learn from American cities because we have a very different context. But if we look up, there are many other examples from the global South and the global North that we could add. And we're looking to grow this database and to include first other states, but then hopefully make sharing and city to city learning a lot easier. So with that, I thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Catherine. That was excellent. Both heartened to hear that other places have gone through this before, or we've all gone through this before and we've rebounded. But also, God, painful to hear once again how poor and people of color communities have absolutely once again borne the burdens. I got one question for you that I have is, so you mentioned that cities and rural areas have come back as well, although you said they had a lot more, it was a lot harder for them. What made the bounce back best? Like in all these different situations, what kinds of policies, what kinds of framings, what kind of investments did cities do that or rural areas do that help them rebound faster?
Yeah, I think the history lesson here is that there's sanitation pieces that need to be put in place, and cities are doing a lot in terms of increasing the distance between people and those public health guidelines and codes that we have, and using data to constantly update them, and then doing that dance between making sure the local economy is staying alive, but also making sure people are staying alive by keeping numbers down. And we have, you've all checked in to see what tier your city is in before you book an appointment for a haircut or decide whether you're going to eat out. So cities they're on it and they're doing that, but not all cities are doing that. A lot of places are refusing to put in public health ordinances or pretending that there's not a pandemic.
So let me ask you, with your background in public health, what of the ordinances that we have now do you think would be good for us to continue so that we can, avoid the next pandemic, as you said? What are the things that we might be looking at?
We were talking about this in one of the earlier sessions, the coffee chat this morning, and cities have opened up streets for dining, and people have flocked to these open air cafeterias, which shows that there's demand. There's clearly demand. And I think the thing that planners and policymakers really need to think about is, and planning is democratized, so you can write to your city council, you can get involved in charrettes. Think about what you're seeing that you like, because you need to advocate in order to keep it. And another piece of that is that there is pent-up demand for other events on the street. For example, cities have opened up sidewalks and parking spaces for brick and mortar restaurants, but they haven't opened those same opportunities for street food vendors or for food trucks. So there's a equity piece that is still missing as cities are making opportunities available for the local economy to thrive during a pandemic. People are showing that there's demand for those opportunities, and I think there's even more demand for open air dining and for reacquainting ourselves with life outdoors, since we live 90% of it indoors now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're going to be talking about exactly some of those issues with Warren in the next session. One last question for you. So you mentioned, as I said before, like a lot of changes have happened, but a lot of this was borne by the poor and BIPOC communities. And then you said, you mentioned really quickly some advice to cities of things that they can do to help, we'll say, mitigate that or erase that. Would be some changes to zoning and things. Like what kinds of changes do you think cities should be looking at to really accelerate that?
In terms of zoning, I had mentioned historic preservation. If you look at cities in Europe that have survived the bubonic plague, they have murals dedicated to what happened. So it's they're keeping it fresh in their thoughts to remember to enjoy life and that they got over things. And then with zoning too, I'm sure Warren will talk about this, as we roll out innovations like sidewalk cafes or e-scooters to make outdoor living easier, we need to make sure that we're doing that for every neighborhood, and especially not just for every neighborhood, maybe even tilting it more towards the most vulnerable communities, because again, those are the communities that are the essential workers who are out there every day coming into contact with the virus and trying to keep the economy running.
That is
I'm giving away his presentation.
That is a fantastic lead-in, as if we'd planned it into Warren's presentation. So she's just tying one thing to the next. Catherine, thank you so much for the presentation and the comments, and really appreciate your being here. And we're gonna transition to Warren, which is already like she's warmed up everyone with those last comments. So Warren Logan, we're thrilled to have him here. He's the Policy Director of Mobility and Interagency Relations for the Mayor's Office in Oakland. He works with the city's DOT, Public Works Department, and other Bay Area agencies on safe and sustainable transportation. And more recently, you might have seen him, he's been a little bit of a rock star in a lot of media around the work he's been doing to help focus, and I'd say refocus, Oakland's transportation initiatives during the pandemic to address equity and community engagement. And we are thrilled to have you here, Warren. And if you want to share your screen, we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you, NICO. I'm really excited to be presenting to all of you. So good morning to everybody. It's now 9:37. So I hope that you're all wide awake. Catherine, thank you for the great segue and for not giving away my presentation too much. Today, I want to share with you kind of the backstory about Oakland Slow Streets. And with that, I'll describe a bit about the launch that we had, the community feedback that we received. And then I want to kind of take a step back and describe a cycle of distrust and disengagement that I've noticed in my career as a transportation planner, and how we used slow streets to disrupt that cycle. And what were our next steps in terms of trying to advance both safe streets for everybody in Oakland while also building trust primarily within our communities of concern. So for many of you probably listening to this presentation, you probably saw one of these images in the news about Oakland slow streets. We launched about this time last year, in fact, and said, we're going to close at the time 74 miles of Oakland's roadways, also known as their neighborhood bikeways, to through traffic as a way to help people spread out, avoid social gatherings, and ideally make some streets safer. And for many folks in Oakland, this image is true. Families were able to go outside and feel welcomed and safe to play and to ride their bikes and to skateboard, to have dance parties, you name it. And then there was the other side of the city. And I'm going to not callously say a big portion of East Oakland felt this. This is a tweet, I won't say who it's from, that said, Libby Schaaf, who's our mayor of Oakland, come get this stuff out of the street. It's creating unsafe driving behavior. And others said that slow streets was gentrification and that it was a tool, I guess, wielded by myself to push Black and brown people out of our city. And some of you in other presentations might have heard me say this. A number of people called my office directly and shared that they were concerned that this program was a ploy to literally trick Black people into catching COVID. And I give these each examples to highlight the very different impacts that slow streets had in Oakland, and to then dive into this cycle that we clearly were falling into. And for many of you, you probably recognize something like this. There are a number of disparate impacts that we see all over the city, primarily within streets we know that are high injury networks, primarily overlap with our low-income communities. That often has a relationship then with pushing neighbors out. They don't feel like they belong, they feel alienated, and then by extension, end up distrusting the very government that ostensibly, at least, and certainly in my case, are trying to address those challenges with innovative programs. Unfortunately, when you don't trust the messenger, in this case, the messenger being the mayor's office or an Oakland DOT, there are then disparate engagement strategies where people are not getting the message. And so in the case of Oakland, and again, for many of you at home listening to this, we lean on community-based organizations to be the go-between. They are the trusted community messengers. But of course, because there are only so few of them, they lack the capacity to share those messages. And then by extension, we have very limited program implementation. And around we go, right? We start again with unsafe driving behavior, more disparate impacts, and over, we go through the cycle of distrusting the government and ultimately not helping the people that we ideally want to help. Slow streets fell right into this. And this is something that I say quite humbly to all of you. Me and my team own that, a lot of slow streets didn't work. And a lot of this presentation is both acknowledging where we went wrong and the ways in which we tried to disrupt this cycle. So you see here, we were falling right into it, right? My slow streets aren't safe. Slow streets are gentrification. Cancel slow streets. Train is never late. People told me, I don't want to talk to you about this program anymore. Just get rid of it. And seeing that we were headed towards this cliff that we always end up in, I said, if this isn't working, we need to try something else. We really need to commit ourselves to figure a different solution before we once again recreate this cycle of distrust and disengagement. And so we committed to weekly workshops with a number of community-based organizations in Deep East Oakland. We forged this partnership and identified a series of targeted solutions. And what that looks like is the Slow Streets: Essential Places program. The group shared with us, hey, if you're trying to make our streets safer, we, and again, I say broadly, we in East Oakland are not able to play in the streets because the streets are so damn dangerous. And I'll talk about that later as well. But we do think that there's an opportunity to help our neighbors connect with essential resources, whether that be clinics, testing sites, grocery stores, the cleaners, And so we went around and in fact, ultimately launched about 15 or 20 essential places that look kind of like these. This one is in fact around the corner from my house, connecting folks here to a community grocery store, the only one in West Oakland, right? Using the same materials to just help people identify where the laser focused challenges were. And if you kind of go back to the scorecard here, we committed to the community, we targeted our implementation where they said so, and upgraded and ultimately had measurable safety impacts that we could prove back to the very groups that said, we don't trust you. And soon into the program, people shared with me, I still don't like slow streets, but at least you committed to fixing the problem. We feel like the Essential Places program, that's our program. We don't know about slow streets, but we own Essential Places. And from that trust, right, we're building blocks here. I had another idea. And so a few months in, we actually received a grant from Smart Growth America and the National Endowment of the Arts to pay the local artist, who's Jonathan Brumfield here on the right side from the mayor in the center, to completely rethink the language that we were using around slow streets, to rebuild the signs in the typography and language that the community would be more responsive to. And I apologize, I don't have a picture of this, but we were able to actually recreate this type of signage on our official aluminum city-sponsored signs. So now all of the slow streets that we continue to roll out have this upgraded signage with the logos from the community, including scraper bikes and this adorable 2 young girls with their cute pom-poms running through the street. And sooner rather than later, people have shared with us, this looks like us. This looks like our community. I can own parts of this now. And that has been so fulfilling for this work, not without its lumps and challenges, certainly. I want to focus your attention on the scorecard that I use, right? When we think about tactical urbanism and these quick build, quick strike programs, they all follow sort of the same goals, right? So we've got, ideally they fit into a master plan, let's say a bike plan or a pedestrian plan. Ideally they're low cost and they scale quickly, right? Everything in the government has to scale as much as it can. And when you look at this, you might say, well, slow streets, Essential Places, and then our arts grant, they look the same. But when you add on these 5 other community-based feedback loops, you recognize that slow streets really missed the mark. We didn't have high-touch engagement. The community felt like they didn't own the program. We didn't provide an iterative rollout where we kept improving. We certainly didn't have a menu of options. And at the time, we didn't provide technical support to showcase our thinking about how we would make the streets safer. And when you compare then slow streets to Essential Places and finally the Slow Streets Art Grant program, you start to see how we were improving on our mistakes. And moving forward, this is our next plan. I've already put this into motion for my poor staff who are probably tired of me now. We're planning on rolling out cultural markets, opportunities for children to play out in the street and near their parks as schools are letting out and going back in during the summer. And then finally rolling our Slow Streets program back into a traditional model of traffic calming. Ideally, recognizing not only that it needs to fit into the metrics for us as a city for master plan low cost and its scale, but that it also are providing this type of community ownership that I feel and have learned quite sincerely during the last year, in fact, is quintessential to a successful program implementation. And so for many of you, and I know a lot about Urbanism Next, you might think, how does this apply, let's take slow streets and then look at new mobility. And hopefully, you all might recall that bike share ran into a very similar challenge, which is that while yes, it was part of, for many of us, a bike plan, they were low cost compared to other programs, and they certainly scaled quickly. Once again, they fell into the same trap, right? Absolutely no community ownership. And so just to make this comparison for folks as we go into the question and answer period, Oakland, once again, is trying to challenge ourselves to rethink what that paradigm might look like. And in fact, we were awarded nearly $30 million in a TCC grant, part of which is going to go to a broad community lending program that encourages and really enables and trains the community-based organizations in Deep East Oakland to run their own long-term bike share program. And it's that type of change, that challenge really back to the community, that I see as transformative, and funny enough, transformative climate initiatives, that makes these programs successful. And so with that, I'm very happy to kind of talk with you, NICO, about any questions you might have, and those in the chat as well.
Thank you so much. That scorecard is gold. God, that top bit that we all is kind of like the takeaway of like, oh yeah, this is how we usually do things, and then to expand it. Oh my God, we are going to be putting that in some newsletters coming out. So I have to say, one of the things that I absolutely love about the entire process that you just talked about is the humility that Oakland had to be able to say like, we did something, and hey, this isn't working. And then being public about, hey, this isn't working. This isn't things that cities usually do. So how is it that they can do it more? Like, so did you get negative pushback when were people like, oh yeah, city, like you messed up again? I mean, how do you make sure that people feel comfortable? How is it that you felt comfortable, your team felt comfortable, and how is it that we can get this to happen in more cities?
NICO, that's a really good question. I will honestly say that there was a point early on when we launched the program and thought, we got a lot of negative feedback from a very specific community. And we said, if we're committed to equity and the group we're trying to help hates this, we should just cancel the program. And that's actually, when you saw that red X, that was that quintessential moment where staff and I checked in and said, like, if it's not working, let's pivot. Like, we need to own our shit, to be honest, right? And the challenge here that I think a lot of cities run into about owning the challenges that they run into and admitting mistakes is that either elected officials or even senior leadership doesn't provide enough space to make low stakes mistakes, right? Like, our risk tolerance is really low. And with slow streets, at the end of the day, they're just plastic barricades. Like, not to limit and dismiss, I think, our pretty awesome program, but there were a number of people who said this isn't working. And I was like, great, pick up the sign and put it to the side, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. And that's the part that I challenge both my staff and then you and the audience of sorts, is to consider not baking your pilots to be multi-million-dollar projects, because at that point, you're stuck. Like, you have to make it work because there's so much money, there's so much time, there's so much effort, like, engaged in a project. Whereas with this one, the program maybe costs us $100,000 for the whole year, right? Like, if it didn't work, like, we could admit it really quickly. And so I recommend to everyone to have like lower stakes engagement.
So it's almost like pilot your pilots.
The pilots we do are not really pilots. Like, if your plan is to make this permanent, it's not a pilot. It's just a phased implementation.
That's great. That's great. I love the risk tolerance for low stakes mistakes. So let me ask you, what kinds of things do you think need to change in cities to make some of these things possible? Like, so, if I'm a city somewhere else in the country and I say like, God, we'd really like to work this way. What advice, and I assume you're going to hear this from staff first, right? God, I'd love to make this happen. What advice would you give them, and how to get this type of thing happening? This way of working.
This way of working, sure. One, create a Department of Transportation that is founded on this mission of trying innovative stuff and encouraging staff to take big leaps. That, our ODOT is new. It's only been around for 4 or 5 years. That was sort of the mayor's stamp on our administration, is to create this department with that goal set in mind. And I think, people talk about mission and leadership, but it's so incredibly important to name the thing that you're trying to do and then to exercise that effort at the same time. The second, and perhaps even more important element that I think makes ODOT a success, even both within its mistakes, is that we hire people from these communities, right? We've started to change our civil service requirements so that we're able to better target the people who have the ideas, that are well worn in these communities, but are not getting the voice in the official departments. And so one of the things I like to share with people is that most of the people in leadership in the city of Oakland grew up here, have lived here their entire lives, right? Like, I've been in Oakland for 10 years. Our city administrator has been here his whole life. These are the people who are representative of the folks we're trying to help. And that makes the communication divide a little less stark.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we, in the session yesterday, the workshop that we were part of, one of the things that came up a lot is because it was all cities trying to work this way, right? They're being nimble. And one of the issues was like, this is a lot of this is high touch. You had that in the scorecard that you had there. You have to like move at the speed of trust, right? How do you scale? Like, so, I've heard you say, in the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, like it's exhausting, right? Like the staff is exhausted. Like, how do you scale when you have to move at the speed of trust and it's a high touch kind of situations?
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. On one hand, I'd say maybe we don't need to scale. Like maybe it's okay that for the next couple of years, we just work on building trust. Because if we're constantly like, let's do more really quickly, then it breaks the trust again. And I will admit, I fall into this every single time I go back to the community. They're like, slow down. The other part that I'll speak to the essential places as an example. The first image I showed you was the first essential place that we launched, like traffic cones and all. And the way that we scaled the essential places program was starting with one and saying, okay, next week, let's talk about 2 more places where this might work. And was there anything about the materials we used or something that could be made better? And then we launched a couple more with better materials. And then we said, okay, well, we've done 5. Where are 5 more that we can build on? So it's kind of a exponential growth, but instead of starting with 10 and going to 100, you start with 1, then go to 10, then 100. And that's the linchpin that I think we've missed out on as transportation planners, is starting extra small to make sure you've figured out the corners of the program and then checking in quickly, then coming back, then starting a little bit bigger.
Mm-hmm. We're getting a whole bunch of questions. Unfortunately, I have time for one more. So I'm going to try to put a couple of questions together, which is, can you talk more about the experience of engaging communities in East Oakland, and how did you find the right leaders? How did you bring community on board? And then how do you share power? I think like a tag onto that.
Yeah, I didn't find them, they found me.
These are the people who are yelling at you, or
yeah, I mean, unfortunately, Oakland is not that big of a city. Like the groups of people who were very, very understandably pissed off at us were already stakeholders within the city. In 2019, which feels like eons ago, we had just finished our bike plan, which is the foundation of Slow Streets, ironically. And so all of these CBOs were already well connected to the city and said, hey, we just finished this. Why didn't you call us? I'm like, that's a great point. Sharing ownership and power is really important. And I will admit, being in the mayor's office, that can be really tricky because, again, that risk tolerance is so challenging, right? And so what we did was we said, and this is kind of my point of starting with one and building, right? We said, okay, what is it that you want us to do with the same tools? And I said, well, if you got to do it this way, pick an intersection that we all know is dangerous. And it was, in fact, 67th and Seminary, which is the deep East Oakland spot where a lot of people keep getting hit. And they said, start there, come back in a week, and we'll talk about it. And being able to sort of slowly but surely hand over more and more power, right? Like, okay, we gave you the location, right? Okay, give us more locations. Pretty much no questions asked. All of the essential places were just the list that they gave us. Like, great, if you feel like this is dangerous, we're gonna go there, right? We're not gonna just say, well, the data doesn't quite point to this. We said, if you are the trusted leaders and feel like this is a problem, let's just go and we'll figure it out along the way.
That's great. I'm going to throw in one of the things that you said yesterday because that was so good, which was that one of the questions that you mentioned you'd ask was, what's the worst thing that can happen? Let's protect against that and let people do anything up to that. I thought that was such a great, create the sandbox and give people power to work within that sandbox.
When having a pandemic as your backdrop, when you say what's the worst that could happen, suddenly you have a ironically comparison. So
great. Warren, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Love the conversation. And yeah, just looking forward to hearing more about how these things continue in the city and sharing it with everyone. Thanks so much. Okay. So Anne, if you want to turn on your video and start sharing your screen as I give you your introduction. We are thrilled here to have, and I should mention, one of the things that we love, what we really try to do in the plenary sessions at Urbanism Next is to get a range of different ideas, right? Things that get us out of our comfort zones, out of the silos that we are often stuck in if we want to or not. And this is a great example how, we really have broad range of topics here. We are thrilled to have Dr. Ann Goodchild here. She's the professor of civil and environmental engineering, leads University of Washington Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics Center, the Freight Lab, as we like to call, Urban Freight Lab that started in 2016. And she, a lot of times, bringing together public and private sectors to address a lot of the challenges of freight. And for any of you who have worked in freight or don't work in freight and have dabbled in questions about it, what you find is there's so little information out there. I mean, compared to like transportation of people, the transportation of goods is an enormous like black box. And so we're thrilled to have Ann here to talk a little bit about the work that they're doing, especially around e-commerce and delivery. So with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Nico. Good morning. My name is Ann Goodchild. I'm the founding director of the Supply Chain Transportation and Logistics Center, which is the home of the Urban Freight Lab at the University of Washington. And we are a work group made up of UW researchers, private companies, and public agencies working in the urban freight space. And I wanted to say thanks to Urbanism Next, to Nico and Becky for the invitation. I'm really grateful for just your leadership and the quality with which you guys deliver and the leadership that you've provided in this space. So I'm really honored to be part of it and to be serving on a virtual panel with Catherine and Warren. I've really enjoyed learning a ton this morning. So I'm going to speak today about how we can build livable cities in the e-commerce era. I also think we all deserve a pat on the back for sort of the patience that we've had with this Zoom life. So thank you for giving me more of your Zoom time. And I, like Nico, look forward to interacting more in person as we hopefully make progress with the pandemic. So people who live in cities must procure the goods they need, right? They can't grow them or produce them entirely on their own. And in fact, this exchange of goods is a really historic and essential role of cities. And the urban freight system, which is really that system that enables provisioning city residents, must exist alongside a number of other urban systems. So planning for this system is challenging, as Nico mentioned, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that we still have quite a limited understanding of urban freight activities, and that's due in part to a lack of publicly available data sources or data collection efforts. Second, I think many important questions really have to do with how we balance the need to move goods with the need to move people and other human needs in cities, and kind of the inherent complexity of those trade-offs. So in addition, the way we shop, which is how we provision ourselves, is continually evolving. E-commerce is a dramatic shift, is one of those big shifts, but we've really seen this system evolve historically with new technologies, vehicle types, right? New concerns, be that cost effective, sort of cost management, monopolization, new policy environments as sort of the political landscape changes, and world events like pandemics. And so I like to sort of juxtapose, a picture of a historic market as a way that we connected providers and customers. But also on the right, you can see the dramatic increase, and at the end there, that's really due to the pandemic in e-commerce and online shopping. So this changing nature is really challenging for urban planners because the built environment and our governance structures have to adapt to these changes in behavior across a broad spectrum of actors: supply chain managers, retail establishments, personal behaviors. And this is particularly difficult when change happens really quickly, as it has very recently. And there's a lag, quite a substantial lag in between the information that we have and the pace at which we can interpret it, And by the time we've sort of figured out what was happening in that data, we are sort of behind in terms of making policy and infrastructure changes. But we must adapt, and adapting will mean changing space allocations in cities, repurposing space from one purpose to another, and rethinking some of our models for streets and public spaces and the models that we use in planning to anticipate vehicle volumes and behavior. And in fact, it was e-commerce and the associated challenges that presented that really led us to create the Urban Freight Lab, because we saw, not only did we need these sort of physical and policy changes, but we also needed a different way of interacting. We needed new ways of engaging across communities. And without that engagement and that work group, we weren't going to be able to understand what we needed to make smart and effective decisions. We want to be really efficient, right, with urban space, and not just sort of passively watch this change happen to us, but we want to collaborate and grow the best parts of this change while trying to mitigate negative impacts. But I will argue, as a community, we are entirely unprepared to do this. And I say that because our sort of institutions are as a whole not prepared in terms of knowledge and resources and structures to lead on this topic and to ensure that delivery services, which are typically associated with e-commerce, are helping to improve cities so that cities can come out of this period of great change with more livable, more sustainable communities. So we'd like to change that. As sort of evidence for that, I would point out that there's very limited urban freight planning in transportation plans. So the Urban Freight Lab reviewed the planning documents for 58 US cities and have found that just five of those cities have standalone urban freight plans, while 55 have bike master plans. And while urban freight is mentioned in about half of the broader transportation plans for that 58 cities, only 10 really have what we would call specific strategies or programs. Many of them are just descriptions of the status quo. And in the absence of this knowledge and capability, I see that freight planning continue at the municipal level really continues to focus on industrial land, on truck activity, such as designating truck routes and heavy haul permits. And we really don't have established policies and programs that look at things like package delivery, meal deliveries, and plans aren't everything, but this is a specific, but they are something. And it is one component sort of how we might evaluate where we are in terms of cities planning for goods movement. But we've been doing some work in Seattle that really indicates that this focus on sort of industrial and manufacturing land uses when we think about freight is really a mistake. So this is a map of West Seattle, just part of Seattle. The different colors are neighborhoods. And you can see the Duwamish River, which runs sort of up through the middle into the Puget Sound. And the area to the right, you can see the sort of T designations. Those are Port of Seattle terminals. There's an industrial district, and then Georgetown and South Park are neighborhoods in the south with substantial residential land use. And then kind of the area to the west is largely residential neighborhoods with some commercial activity. The industrial district is actually classified as a manufacturing industrial center, which is quite a significant zoning code that protects this land for industrial activity. And it's quite an influential designation in terms of regional transportation planning. The Urban Freight Lab has developed some more up-to-date estimates of freight trip demand for the region. And when you look at the trip end estimates for the East and the West, you see that almost 74% of the freight trip ends in the East are associated with industrial property. That's the predominant land use in that area. And in the West, the freight trip ends are predominantly associated with residential property. And again, it is a residential neighborhood with some commercial activity. But what the estimates also show is the magnitude, the total number of freight trip ends are overwhelmingly to residential locations. So if we think about freight planning being directed by volume of activity, we should very much be focused on this freight activity in residential neighborhoods, and we're not. Many models or regional models have as an assumption, zero freight trips to residential neighborhoods. So that's a mistake. And actually, overall, about 70% of this region's freight trip ends are to residential locations, and about 25% to industrial. So I would argue that urban freight, which has been highly influenced by e-commerce, is now a residential problem. And we really kind of institutionally haven't adapted to this, haven't begun to address this. We are largely still thinking about freight at the planning level as a sort of manufacturing and industrial challenge. The figure on the left shows sort of which sub-neighborhood has the greatest total number of freight trip ends, and the figure on the right shows the sub-neighborhood with the greatest density of freight trip ends. It's the higher residential density in Genesee. So what can we do, to sort of back to our original charge to, use this shift to e-commerce to help us move towards more sustainable, kind of neighborhood compatible models of provisioning. Well, one thing we should do is do freight planning and do it for residential neighborhoods. Traditional delivery services, so one where we have consolidated cargo in a single vehicle, like the picture on the right, not one pizza in one car, can provide a sustainability improvement. When we think about replacing individual car trips to the store with consolidated delivery vehicles, much like transit, we can reduce the CO2 per package, much like transit. And we have some services like that, right? We have garbage collection, we have the postal service, and the pandemic has shown us that we can very much substitute delivery services for personal travel, that people are quite comfortable with that at this point. We want to use contextually appropriate models. So we might think about, e-commerce means, box trucks in neighborhoods. That does not have to be the case. And, I always uphold the USPS as an example of someone who has historically used context sensitive models for delivery. You see them on foot, you see them on bikes, you see them in purpose-built vehicles for neighborhoods. And we are also comfortable with some consolidated models like garbage and compost collection and the USPS. At the neighborhood scale, we can use neighborhood appropriate vehicles. We can use smaller vehicles that are more appropriate for residential neighborhoods and compatible with those environments. They can be safer, quieter, lower emissions, and cities should be experimenting with and how they can support and enable sort of access points for goods. And our term for that is a microhub. This can provide delivery density, which improves sustainability and can catalyze sort of zero emissions last mile technologies. These microhubs can be pleasant public spaces, allowing for convenience and neighborhood connectivity. So to summarize, cities should be doing freight planning, and they should be doing freight planning with a focus on residential neighborhoods. They should be, this should be transportation planning where we're thinking about personal trip making and commercial trip making in an integrated way. Though there might be a micro hub with access for goods at a park and ride location. Cities need to build freight expertise and a freight planning function and should expect to understand and support strategies that improve sustainability, such as zero emissions or low emissions delivery vehicles, and explicitly providing space for micro consolidation points or common delivery lockers. And they should have the staff to explore and manage these programs. They should also reach out to neighborhoods. In my experience with freight planning, when we talk about freight stakeholders, it tends not to include neighborhoods or neighborhood residents or representatives of neighborhood residents. And I think that's because it hasn't been thought about as sort of a neighborhood problem or a residential problem. And that needs to change. We should expect, the vehicles and this system to not just to adapt to neighborhoods, but to be determined by neighborhoods. And not see us, neighborhoods as sort of passively having to accept what they're given, but to, to create the kind of delivery model that they want. So I think it's fair to say that sustainable cities will have sort of low car dependence and limited SOV trips. And when we start thinking about passenger and commercial travel in an integrated way, we might see that car-free living is actually enabled by delivery services, okay? Or delivery services make it easier or more possible for many people to live in a car-free way. And COVID-19 has shown us this. It's shown us that we can substitute delivery for personal shopping trips. And perhaps, high quality, consolidated, efficient delivery services can actually make, a car-free life more appealing. And when delivery is through efficient, shared models with a kind of good delivery density, that reduced car dependence, may even if we see increased delivery activity, the total may be a lower CO2 footprint. And that's the kind of environment we want to build. That's the other thing, is that if delivery services reduce car dependence, we free up space for parking and just vehicle activity, and we can allocate those spaces to other uses and build the kind of neighborhoods that we really want to live in. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Anne. Wow, that was great. The two slides that are buzzing in my head, 5 of 58 cities have urban freight plans. And the slide that you showed, 94% of freight trips being in residential areas, 19,000 trips versus 2.5 in industrial areas. Like the thing that's screaming in my head is, oh my God, this is like what TNCs, right? When TNCs happened, all of a sudden it exploded all over cities, and cities realized we don't have a plan for this. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we're in the same place with urban freight, but it's been here for a long time. How is it that has happened? So one of the questions I have for you is, why? I mean, cities seem ill-prepared for this, right? Obviously on the data side, but absolutely it seems so on the regulatory side, on the planning side. Why are cities so ill-prepared? Why are we so behind in this?
Yeah, well, it's like a long conversation I've had with many people. I mean, I think that everyone was pretty happy, and I mean that sort of carriers and shippers and the cities as well were pretty happy working independently. And I guess for carriers and shippers, that's sort of doing their business, doing their thing, and not really engaging in the planning process. And cities, went along and focused on, passenger travel, and that worked arguably for a long time. And I think there's some complexity about people's how we think about, planning for this sort of for-profit, private sector system, and how does that balance against planning for people and residents, and perhaps that also sort of made people comfortable with the fact that there wasn't a lot of planning for sort of the goods movement system. But I think that, that became untenable about 5 years ago when we started the Urban Freight Lab, just with, the mounting volumes and congestion and, air quality concerns and mobility, accessibility being so constrained in cities like Seattle. And so it sort of, I think in some ways planners started looking at freight as, hey, we've done so many things in so many areas, but we need to do more. What can we do on sort of the freight side? And users of that system feeling like it's so difficult and it's so costly, sort of, to find parking or to move around in this city, that there was more interest in engaging with the public sector.
So what do you, and so, you've been working on this for a while. You've seen, you just said a couple of years ago, people started realizing, what do you think are the most persuasive arguments? I'm really having this like, oh my goodness, we're when we picked up a lot of this research 4 or 5 years ago, was TNCs are really starting to pick up. What do you find now the most persuasive arguments to cities that are working, right? That's working to get them to be like, oh my God, no, we do need to pay attention to this. I'm hoping that what you say here, people who are listening will now take these, run to their cities and run up the flagpoles and try to get that attention.
Yeah, that's a good question too. When I have spoken to some cities who are not yet kind of interested, one of the things I've heard them say is people don't complain about freight. They don't get calls, with complaints. So that was the first time I really learned that was how so that's your basis for sort of how you allocate your time, is how many complaints you're getting. So I think it's, so maybe in a lot of neighborhoods or a lot of areas that's still not happening. But I think in some urban centers and places like Seattle, that is happening because there is some push from city residents, that commercial vehicles are parking illegally or consuming space that using space that they shouldn't be, or behaving in an unsafe manner. So it's those sort of complaints from residents, I think, are powerful, and they should be. But maybe there's things going on that people aren't complaining about, or communities that aren't complaining at the same volume as other communities. I think that there's also some very positive, motivation now on the emission side, and I think there's low-hanging fruit in the freight space, and we really can be part of solutions that will help us meet our goals in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So I see that as the C40 cities and that as an area that motivates sort of city leadership to look at freight and invest in seeing how they can improve outcomes there.
So we are getting a ton of questions coming in right now. So one of them is, are there good examples of cities taking the lead in creating people-centric, neighborhood-centric freight? And this is from Blaine Merger, working with Gail's office, who's very interested in public space. So neighborhood-centric freight plans, people-centric, neighborhood-centric freight plans, and what are the best practices? Who are the leaders?
I want to say that there are neighborhood scale. So in Seattle, we are working in Belltown to implement some new technologies, and part of that has been, we can do better than we have. I still want to do more, but part of that has been through engaging the Belltown Business Association and the Belltown Neighborhood Association, and really working with individual, buildings and individual landlords. And so, that is part of a pilot project, but that is not yet, what I would call sort of established practice. And I really think that communities have not been engaged in neighborhood scale freight planning. There's some examples, with port related freight activity, where there's been specific areas of concern like Georgetown and South Park in Seattle, which are really close to the port. But that's a different kind of freight as well, because it's largely sort of marine containers, and it's not the kind of freight that we can't separate from communities, because we're bringing them food and we're removing their garbage. So it has some different solutions really on the sort of port related freight side.
That's great. We've got a lot of questions. I'm only going to have time to ask one more because I want to give everyone a break before we go to this next piece. But I'm going to put a couple questions together that we've gotten. And the question is about data. It seems like one of the big issues here is that we don't have information about how people are, how freight's moving around. So I'm going to put together a couple questions. One, are you getting companies to share data, and what do you think needs to happen to get that? Get companies to share data? And if you could ask for one piece of data or two pieces of data, what is it that you would most want? So again, giving people targets who are listening of things that they should be chasing.
Yeah. So in the Urban Freight Lab, we are built on, our focus was building a community of trust. And I think a huge mistake people make with data is they ask for data first and they don't have trust. And, that's just not the right way to do it. It's like having it's like thinking, well, I need to move and I need some help. So I'll go, find a friend who will help me move. Instead of thinking, I'll build friendships, and then when I move, someone will be there to help. So I really think that we do need to and I love Warren's comments about sort of starting with communities and building relationships and perhaps not worrying yet about scale and trying to understand and solve problems there first. So I think that's a big part. We can't ask people to give us data where we haven't told them, what we're going to do with it. And probably what we're going to do with it is limit their activity, regulate them. So surprise, surprise, they're a little concerned about doing that. So I think that's a big problem. And we have to talk about trust and partnerships first. And then I think there's some analytical challenges to it, but there is, right, a proliferation of sensors on, all of these vehicles and the handheld devices. And so I think, there is availability of some of that data. It's hard sometimes to know who it represents. It's hard to know. So there's some analytical challenges, but it's a lot better than nothing. And there's a lot of kind of, fairly, not just high level, but pretty aggregate information that we can get from that is very useful. We don't really need, we don't need to know where individual vehicles are going, but, if we know that 70% of them are destined to residential neighborhoods versus 30, that's hugely insightful. So I do think, and, we have that kind of relationship with some of our partners. It would be great if we could build more consistent, data sharing mechanisms at state or federal levels. And the last thing I'll say is it costs money, and we don't have programs to do it, right? Our MPOs have funds and programs for collecting travel data, and that's an accepted cost. Well, we need to do that. It costs money to collect that data, or we need political sort of will to require that data be submitted. The airline industry is very easy to analyze because there's compliance and requirements for data submissions. We could do that, but we haven't yet. So I think there's also some will and some acknowledgement that it's not going to fall from the sky, and we are going to have to pay for it or put some money into putting together mechanisms to obtain it.
This is great. So interesting. I'm so glad that you came and gave the presentation. I think one thing that's the takeaway from all the things you were just saying, trust again. I mean, I feel like we should have a parallel session in Urbanism next, which is just like how to develop trust. It comes up over and over again, which I think is just a great theme. And then the other piece is I think everyone who's listening should be going to ask their city if they have an urban freight plan. And if not, should call Ann to help figure out how to make that happen. Really appreciate.
We do
go ahead.
Well, we do have a technical assistance program right now with an offer out to cities to help with any kind of, you can write a proposal. We want to help cities develop urban freight capabilities. So yeah, I don't know if I have time, but I'll try to put the link in the chat. So
put it in the chat, and also maybe there's the chat for overall. If people haven't seen it, there's the overall. You can chat with the entire community through the portal, and you can add that there as well. And tell people your website address so that people can go look for things there.
Yeah,
is it easy?
It's so long. So here, I'm gonna put I have it right here. I can put it in the chat. Let me make it go to everybody. So the link there is, you can see that's the announcement for the technical assistance program, and also, you can find the whole.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for being part of these plenaries. We went over time a little bit. We had such interesting questions and great engagement. So you all get a break for about 15 minutes. Go stretch your legs, look at something further away than your monitors, and hopefully some sunshine. And we'll see you all in the breakout sessions and the concurrent sessions in about 15 minutes. Thank you, Ann. Thanks to everyone, all our presenters today, and for everyone attending. And we'll talk to you soon.